Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Donnelly.
And I'm Dr. Hinson.
And we are the Good Doctors of Abbey Research, coming to you with our recap and analysis of episode 5 of season 2 of The Handmaid's Tale, entitled Seeds. And this is a very rich and dense episode that I think was probably emotionally traumatic upon first viewing for both of us. But
for a lot of people.
Reflection, we've found quite a lot to discuss and hope over, believe it or not.
Yeah, actually.
So for the first time ever, we are going to give you 2 videos on one episode. Two. So in this particular video, we'll be doing a brief recap, a quick discussion of what we think of the geography of Gilead, and then giant T.
So many questions.
Then Dr. Hinson's going to be unpacking our precious Janine and some really analytical thoughts about imprisonment. And then we'll hit pause, say goodbye, and then you can go right into the next video, or you can take a break. And I'm going to be talking a whole lot about purity culture, Gilead, and the wedding. Yeah. So, again, as always, spoilers, fun, ahoy, as Extra Hot Great Podcast would say. So away we go. In this episode, we start off with June, really her most disassociated self, and she is outwardly off-red. And she does things like burn the letters that she had been collecting. She talks.
Oh, that made me so sad.
She talks to Nick entirely in Gileadisms. And there's really 3 parallel storylines in this episode. There's June and her body. And then there's what's happening at the Waterfords and what's happening in the colonies. So with June and her body, she disassociates. And then about 20 minutes into the episode, she starts to bleed to the point where I think we're led to believe she's miscarrying. Yeah. And she doesn't tell anyone. And she just quietly bleeds through the entire episode until the end, where her true love, Nick, finds her.
We've totally written off Luke.
Well, they're different versions of each other now. Like,
I know.
Anyway, so this version of June, I think, does love Nick quite a lot.
Oh, for sure. Oh, yeah. No, it's possible to love multiple people in your life, of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Nick finds her in a sewer trough
outside. Clearly fell through the window.
Yeah, and I think she was like I think she might have been intentionally doing that.
Oh, I think we're led to believe that, because if she just kind of passed out in the windowsill, that wouldn't have been enough force to break the window.
Oh, that's true. Okay, so she tried to kill herself, and Nick finds her.
Yeah.
And then she wakes up in a hospital with a baby monitor on and says to the baby, I'll get you out of here. Yeah. I'm not going to let them do this to you. Yeah. So then the Waterford storyline is that Serena has decided to try to make Offred her bestie, and they're trying to chat about the pregnancy. And I just kept screaming at the screen, you cannot have your cake and eat it too, sweetheart. Like, you can't humanize her and then talk about the Kardashians with her. It doesn't work.
Yeah, you can't put people into slavery and then expect them to be happy slaves. No.
Doesn't work.
No.
This isn't a minstrel show. So that is happening at the same time as Commander Waterford is super threatened by Nick. And by Nick's progeny.
Yes.
And so tries to promote him to Washington, and instead is told to marry him off. Yeah. And then the wedding becomes a mass ceremony where all of the the best and the brightest of Gilead are in attendance, including Offred, who has to watch Nick marry another woman while she is miscarrying their child. And then I say woman really, really loosely, because she's a 12-year-old girl.
Because she's clearly just had her first period and now is capable of marrying off.
Capable? Yeah. That poor child.
Yeah, capable implies agency and choice. Sorry, she is now chosen to.
Yeah, she's been assigned.
Off. Yeah.
And we follow them back home. Evidently, they're living with the Waterfords now, and we get some really, really dodgy theology that I'll unpack in the next video. Yeah. Some really, really dodgy sex ed that I'll unpack in the next video.
Oh boy.
So that's the Waterfords. And it all ends, the whole episode with both of those storylines, June and the Waterford, ends with Nick finding June.
Yeah.
So then in the colonies, Emily, Rory Gilmore, and Janine of the One Eye are working together and doing this great juxtaposition dance the entire episode about how Emily keeps saying, why are you so happy? Why are you so hopeful? We're going to work and die. That's all we do here. And Janine, her resistance is joy, essentially. And she ends up orchestrating a wedding between a dying woman and the woman that woman has fallen in love with. There's some beautiful things, great conversations about cows and dandelions. And it is pretty apparent to us that somehow the colonies have more freedom than Gilead does in a very bizarre way that Dr. Hinson and I are pretty sure has to do with Gilead's hubris and not any sort of intentional planning.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that.
Yeah. So many of you have been asking us what we think Gilead is. And before this episode, I was really positive that it was just bounded to Boston. And then we hear this conversation between Commander Waterford and Commander Vest. I don't know his name. He was wearing a vest. About how a group of commanders are going to come to Gilead. Yeah. And they are going to be given Gilead hospitality to take back to their districts.
Yes.
So, and we're also told that Washington is involved somehow.
Yeah. Oh, wait, I just had a thought. Because I know we've talked about this, but I was thinking on that map, on the train map, they had those numbers. Maybe those are districts in Gilead. Maybe that map was just Gilead, which is just that area. Because it had it looked like zones, right? It was one.
Yeah, like a subway zone. But then what does that mean about Washington? Do we still know?
I don't know. Washington clearly still exists.
Yeah.
And
so my theory that
an elevated position because it would have promoted Nick to go to Washington.
I think we're living in some sort of Articles of Confederation bound colonial system where there's still So I thought at one point that the nuclear bomb went off in Washington and that's clearly not true.
No.
Unless we've moved Washington, which sounds silly.
Which would be weird.
So maybe it happened in Chicago. And that's where they are. I don't know. We're never going to get answers because they don't care about answers.
Yeah, I know. Sometimes I'm we spend some time thinking about this and to what end? They're never going to tell us.
They're never going to tell us. So I still think that it's that there is more to Gilead than Boston. Or sorry, more to this new world than Boston, but that Gilead is Boston.
Yeah.
That's my thought, because you never, when people are talking about Southern hospitality or Irish hospitality, they're never talking about it to other people of that.
Right, yeah. Clearly they were referencing outsiders.
Who are also commanders.
Who were, who were coming in. Yeah.
So, pals, tell us in the comments.
What do you guys think?
We don't know.
Does anybody else spend, inordinate amounts of time thinking about Gileadian geography? Because we would just really like a map. I
would love a map. I love a good map to begin with.
Like a tourist handbook.
Yeah, could a Lonely Planet person whip us up a guide to Gilead? That would be great.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah, so we'll move on now to the imprisonment stuff, but we are gonna throw some links up in the show notes. For instance, to the wedding is very reminiscent of a cult called the Moonies. Yeah. Which do mass, they're the Unification Church and they do mass weddings. So we're going to, for people who want to deep dive into cults in particular, since I'm not going to get to that in the second video, we're going to check out the show notes for that. And then we're also going to give you a little bit of a conversation about why the kind of American religious system around World War II and 1950s and how we became, how we got some of the language that we use now a lot, specifically because the hymn that started the wedding is called Onward Christian Soldiers, and where that came from and what that looks like and all that kind of stuff. And there's a book specifically that covers that, From the Bible Belt to the Sun Belt, it's called, and we'll throw a link in the show notes to that too if you want to deep dive. So in the meantime, Dr. Hinson.
Yes.
Imprisonment expert extraordinaire.
Thank you, Dr. Donnelly.
Take it away.
Thank you. Yeah. So This episode, at first glance, I thought what was happening from my perspective, from my expertise standpoint, was fairly obvious. But then Dr. Donnelly and I like marinated in this episode for a while. So that was really helpful. I have like 12 pages of notes. I have a Google Doc open in front of me right now that's going to help me reference everything that I wanted to say. So I wanted to start with this idea of freedom that we've been talking about this season, in and out. It started in episode 1, where Aunt Lydia differentiates between like kind of the old America and the new Gilead, talking about freedom to versus freedom from. So when all the handmaids are being punished in the rain holding the rocks, if anybody doesn't remember that scene, and they're being punished for their collective resistance. And Aunt Lydia tells them, he has given you, God, has given you everything, but when he asked you for faith, you refused. You are told the will of God, and you say, I know better. You say, I know better than God himself. He loves you. He protects you. He put you in this system where you're systematically raped. Oh, wait, that's not what she said. Don't you remember what it was like before? Now you are safe. Girls, there is more than one kind of freedom. There is freedom to and freedom from. In the days of anarchy, it was freedom to. Now it is freedom from. That is a gift from God. Do not underrate it. So the more I thought about this episode, the more I realized really what they're showing us in terms of imprisonment themes is this idea between freedom to and freedom from. And it's not just the theme. I'm not arguing anymore that it's the theme for episode 1. I think it's the theme for the whole season, from my perspective. Certainly there are religious themes that Dr. Donnelly is going to get into, but that's my academic analysis. So the fundamental truth, right, of human beings as people is that we crave freedom too, which a lot of other people, when I looked this up online, talking about it in the book, called it personal freedom. So agency, autonomy, choice, right? We all kind of crave that kind of freedom. We're built for it, human beings. And throughout history, governments and states and all kinds of groups and cults and societies have exercised power and control. And a lot of times they do this through freedom from, removing parts of that freedom and agency away. So, I mean, even our government has it. Like, there are things that we aren't free to do. Personal freedom doesn't mean, you're free to run around the streets and, kill people or break laws, whatever. So governments do that in all manner of ways. And in all my studies of political imprisonment, which the handmaids clearly are political prisoners, could be framed as the authorities setting up a system of freedom from. But they're not going to call it that in these situations, because usually with prisoners, with incarcerated people, they're being removed from everyday normal society into an abnormal site of incarceration. But in Gilead, their prison is all around them. Joyous joy that it is. So instead of being set aside from society and being called criminals or terrorists or internees or whatever, in Gilead, they have to use this religious language about God and faith and freedom to and freedom from, to keep them imprisoned in this new normal society. And the removal of individual and group autonomy is fundamentally what incarceration is, whether it's political or otherwise. But invariably, what we get to see in this episode, and in most of these episodes really, is that imprisoned people find a way to express some form of political freedom. Some way to reference what used to be normal before they entered this incarceration space or cycle of society. And Dr. Donnelly and I talked about this earlier when we were prepping for this video. And she pointed out very rightly so that this only works for people who have a different frame of reference. So they are able to reference their past life and their past self and, normal society, whether that means outside of their incarceration or actually in the past, because have these frames of reference to freedom too. Because we guess that Gilead's like
5 years, yeah.
5 years? We don't know. We guess so much.
And this is, I think, one of the things that makes people have such a hard time understanding why people stay in cults.
Yeah.
Or stay in oppressive regimes. And it's like, you have to, people who ask those questions are very rarely putting themselves in the shoes of the person in the oppressive regime.
Right.
And this is why. Yeah.
There's a lot of strategic calculations that have to be made.
Mm-hmm.
And we see a lot of people in Gilead playing kind of the more long game, which I think Nick is one of the great examples of somebody who is playing a long game and always trying to reel June back in previous episodes. Like, you can't push this hard, you can't go this far, we have to be careful. So a lot of people all have different types of survival mechanisms, which I'll get to in a minute. So we see the handmaids referencing this freedom too, referencing their past selves by writing those letters that June then burned, telling jokes and making references to past society and that kind of stuff, asserting that sense of self that is now no longer allowed. Mm-hmm. And this episode really, really encapsulated for us like the fundamentals of what freedom 2 means, mm-hmm. which is like the freedom to love.
Yeah. And that love is political.
And that love is political. And that love is resistance in this instance of Gilead. In this particular form of incarceration, love is resistance, mm-hmm. Fundamentally. So that freedom 2 is freedom to love, to have human connections, to emote, for flip's sake, to have relationships that are meaningful. And we're seeing that emerge with all of the characters, which was absolutely fascinating. So Commander Waterford is concerned for Offred and like jealous of Nick. Emotions that are not allowed in Gilead. Serena Joy is frustrated and snarky and sarcastic, which is stupid because she made this prison literally herself, but she's still snarky about it. And then in the colonies, which was like really strangely the place of hope this episode. The rabbi who performs the prayers when they're taking away the dead, and then she gets to perform the wedding, which was beautiful. And our dear Janine, blowing the seeds of the dandelion and talking about flowers and arranging the wedding for Kit and the other woman. I couldn't find her name, but I remember saying Kit, I think, was the woman who died. So they're finding ways to resist freedom from and to assert freedom to. And those are mechanisms of resistance and survival, which is really cool. Everyone's feeling the strain of performing these roles as well. And so you're starting to see people crack under this pressure, not just in the Waterford household. I think your woman who was a housewife, who was like upset that her baby was teething, everyone's kind of starting to crack. And Serena Joy, which is great. Well, Dr. Donnelly's gonna get into what Serena Joy did, but telling Nick's new child bride that she can enjoy sex is resistance. That she can form an attachment to her husband is resistance. So we're seeing these different survival mechanisms on display, which are essential to surviving imprisonment, incarceration. So June is either conforming or resisting. She's pretty much conforming right now, but she's resisting through her miscarriage, through not telling anyone of her miscarriage. Emily, our dear Rory Gilmore, is surviving on her pessimism.
Cynicism alone.
Cynicism is fueling everything.
Yep.
And determination. She hasn't given up yet. I think there's still hope in her, which we see at the end. And Janine is surviving through this beautiful optimism, through always choosing to find hope. And when Emily tells her, now we're cows being worked to death and you're dressing up the slaughterhouse for them, Janine is like on the spot, looks at her and goes, cows don't get married. I'm a human being. We love each other. We're not cows. It was great. It was so fantastic. So she's always refused to be dehumanized and survives through love. That's how Janine, through loving things, that's how Janine survives. And that's how we all survive, really. So there's the big, broader symbolism. And at the end of the episode, we see the colonies in a freer state than the handmaids. So because Gilead doesn't care about them, and they literally don't think they're women anymore. They're unwomen. So they're free to chat to each other and sing songs and bury their dead in individualized graves. I'm like, these people aren't individuals anymore, but you're letting them each have a headstone cross? Hubris is what effectively Dr. Donnelly and I decided is the answer to why that's allowed to happen. But every time that they're given that space, they have that void of where they're not being watched and they're not being controlled. They fill that void with hope and love and resistance. So they find these small moments of joy, whether it's touching somebody's hand or making a bouquet of flowers for the wedding, and the ring out of the wheat was really, really lovely symbolically. And it's all about finding your sense of self and maintaining a sense of self, which in my studies of political imprisonment, that is the absolutely key to being able to survive, is maintaining some sense of self. Whether it's your faith system, like Janine, who still clearly believes that God is a good and just God who will save them. Or whether it's, June being snarky in her internal monologue, which we didn't get. So we see freedom to and freedom from illustrated in the two wedding ceremonies, literally the removal of agency and choice and autonomy, and then the freedom to choose love for the two women in the colonies, which was great. And we see this with June. The only time June actually appears on the surface is when she realizes that the man that she loves and has a connection with and has made a baby with is going to marry a small child. So that's when she gets emotional, and that's the only time we see June. And we see her resisting in her passive way by not telling anyone about the miscarriage. If she was 100% like robot Offred, she would have told them when she started bleeding. But clearly our June feels like the only way she can resist them anymore is by letting the baby die, and by dying herself in the end when she realizes that she's miscarrying, and she, I think, jumps out of the window. So she can take that from Gilead. Gilead doesn't get to have her or her baby. The Waterfords don't get their baby. Aunt Lydia doesn't get to cry for joy, presumably, at the birth of that child. But when she realizes that the baby's still alive, that's when she switches back to June brain. And she says, they do not own you, and they do not own what you will become. So fundamentally, what she is going to give this baby is the freedom to choose. Freedom to. And then the title of the episode is what I wanted to finish on, because it was very powerful symbolically in this episode. We talked about kind of and Dr. Donnelly will get into the seeds a little bit as well in her talk, I know. But she mentioned, when we started talking about it, she mentioned this Mayan proverb that I had never heard before that I thought was pretty perfect for this, that they buried us, but they did not know that we were seeds. So I know, everybody, right? Powerful, right? I know. But seeds represent like the future. Spreading of seeds is, you can talk children, growing society, all of this kind of stuff, but it's hope, it's growth, it's things that we nurture, things that we care for so that they can grow. It can be seeds of the resistance and seeds of the revolution, but if they're giving us a tip about what that resistance looks like, it's going to be in small chunks. It's going to be these little things that eventually chip away at the foundation of Gilead. And it's going to be love, everybody. So you thought this episode was depressing. Guess what? It was actually all hopeful. And then next week, they're going to take all my hopes away. I just know it. But we see the power of the collective, the power of people together. And that's really at the end. By the end, Emily kind of comes around and is like, oh, you know what? Solidarity, sisters, is really a good thing. And that's one way that even if these women are all going to die, and they probably will all die in the colonies before anything happens, they will resist power and they will resist the control of their lives in any way that they can. And even if they all die, at least they're going to die with a semblance of self and some humanity and some dignity. And that's not a small thing, as Janine showed us. That is not a small thing at all. So that was what I got from this episode, which was a lot. But I think now that I've kind of unpacked all of these big ideas, it'll be easier to keep referencing them as we go, having given you guys my whole brain dump. But look out for Freedom To and Freedom From. I think it's the framework for this season in terms of that theory.
And in a great example of how our brains work differently and how introvert brains and extrovert brains work differently, I immediately after seeing this episode said to Dr. Hinson, like, wow, there's a lot for you to talk about. And her immediate response is, I don't think so. And then we started talking and she just kept talking and kept talking and kept talking. I was like, yeah, see, there's a lot for you to talk about.
It takes me longer to process things than Dr. Donnelly for sure, which is another reason why it's helpful that we kind of do these episodes the week after.
We've gotten some questions as to why we don't do them the day after they drop, and there's your answer, because it's richer if the more time we give Dr. Hinson to marinate, the richer the content is.
Very true. Very true. Also, we're busy. So
also, we have clients.
Also, this is not our only job, but yes,
shocking.
Also, it gives me time to reflect. So that is what I have for you. We're going to hit pause on this for now. The second part of this episode analysis will go up immediately as well. So if you want to go on to Dr. Donnelly's religious analysis, feel free. Or take a break.
There is no judgment.
Go for a walk. Watch it in a couple of days. Whatever. As always, let us know what you guys think on the old keyboards. We love hearing from you, and we'll see you for part 2.
Can't wait. Thanks, guys.
Bye.